Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Prospective Applicant webinar for the Sustaining Cultural Heritage Collections Grant Program, offered by the National Endowment for the Humanities. I'm Joshua Sternfeld, a Senior Program Officer in the Division of Preservation and Access. For this webinar, I will be discussing the 2023 Sustaining Cultural Heritage Collections Grant Program, or SCHC for short. I'll begin with an overview of the program, discuss the three levels of funding and what they support, and then move on to the application and review process. All the information I'm going to discuss today can be found on the Program Information page, found on NEH's website. From the home page, click on Grants in the upper menu, which will take you to an option to search by program or division. Sustaining cultural heritage collections grants help institutions plan for and implement projects to protect collections, to prevent deterioration and damage, and ultimately to ensure that collections are available for use today and into the future. A distinctive feature of the program, which I want to highlight, is its emphasis on sustainable and resilient preventive conservation strategies. Strategies that balance preservation effectiveness with collection-specific risks, energy costs, and environmental impact. This is one of the only grant programs in the U.S. that encourages museums, libraries, and archives to plan and implement preservation measures in environmentally and fiscally sustainable ways, while also anticipating and responding to risks posed by natural or man-made disasters, changing weather or land use patterns, or other location-specific risks. Effective and sustainable preservation strategies must be informed by the nature of an institution and its collections. Your organization is ready to apply to SCHC if you have completed the process of basic preservation planning, which might include a general preservation assessment, collection inventory, emergency plan, or basic assessments of building and storage environments. These basic plans can be funded independently or through NEH's Preservation Assistance Grants grant program, which shares the January 12th deadline. You can find an informational webinar for that program on its program page. Using priorities established through foundational preservation plans, applicants to SCHC should consider how to address long-term collection care needs in a collaborative and interdisciplinary fashion. Sustainable preservation strategies can take many forms, depending on collection materials, the building envelope, and the local climate, but should rely on best practices in sustainable and resilient collections care. A successful SCHC project demonstrates an understanding of preservation needs based on your collection's materials, their conditions, and the risks that they face, rather than relying on prescriptive targets, such as a constant or static temperature and relative humidity. Your project should also consider the characteristics and performance of the building in which your collections are housed, its envelope and its mechanical systems, and their role in moderating interior environmental conditions. For example, you might discuss the impact of the local climate on establishing relative humidity and temperature set points and managing interior environmental conditions. You may also evaluate risks to collections associated with changes in average weather conditions, natural disasters, or other emergencies. Preventive strategies ought to weigh initial and ongoing energy use, costs, and environmental impacts of potential preservation strategies, while prioritizing passive and non-mechanical ways to improve and manage collection environments and risks. The SCHC program promotes the development and implementation of solutions tailored to the capabilities of the organization and its staff. You should evaluate and measure the effectiveness of project results through the collection of data on environmental conditions, energy use, and costs. Before explaining in further detail the various levels of funding, I would briefly like to highlight ineligible activities. SCHC cannot fund general conservation or preservation assessments and other basic preservation projects that would be more suitable for our other grant program, preservation assistance grants for smaller institutions. You may also not undertake new construction or installation of equipment as a component of a new construction project, nor may you renovate or restore an historic structure when those renovations do not impact the preservation of humanities collections housed in the structure. For a full list of SCHC funding restrictions, you should refer to page 32 of the Notice of Funding Opportunity. This year, we are introducing a new level of funding in addition to the implementation and planning levels previously supported by SCHC. Planning projects rely on an interdisciplinary team to solve complex preservation challenges. Planning can involve the drafting of space plans, risk assessments, environmental monitoring, testing, and modeling. The new funding level is what we call Level 1 Implementation Projects. It was designed specifically to support small to mid-sized institutions to address discrete preservation challenges, such as small-scale improvements to lighting or environmental conditions using environmentally sustainable methods. Level 2 implementation projects address more comprehensive preventive conservation projects based upon interdisciplinary planning. You are not required to have a planning grant to apply for and receive an implementation grant. Many organizations can self-fund the planning or complete it as part of a long-range strategic or collection planning process. Now, let's go into more detail about each of the three levels of funding. SCHC planning grants support interdisciplinary and collaborative planning by teams of preservation professionals, architects, engineers, building managers, among others, that can identify institution-specific approaches to preservation. These awards are up to $50,000 for a 2-year period of performance. Project teams should evaluate the nature of the collection, the performance of the building in moderating internal conditions, the nature of the local climate, the cost effectiveness and energy efficiency of various approaches to preventive conservation, and the impact on the environment of the options being considered. This kind of interdisciplinary and collaborative planning is one of the keys to identifying sustainable strategies. There are a variety of activities that you might undertake for a planning project, and I encourage you to consider options listed on pages 3 and 4 of the Notice of Funding Opportunity. Highlighting just a couple of those options, you might conduct a risk assessment to improve institutional resilience in the face of disasters resulting from natural or human activity. Or you may examine passive, non-mechanical, and low-energy alternatives to conventional energy sources and energy-intensive mechanized systems for managing environmental conditions. An example of a successful planning grant was submitted by the University of Wyoming for their archaeological repository. The planning project was to develop a collection preservation plan for an archaeological faunal collection containing 800 boxes of bone artifacts from 15 sites in the Great Plains. The at-risk collection of bone beds spans 13,000 years of prehistory and supports critical research in zooarchaeology, hunter-gatherer archaeology, Native American studies, and anthropology. The interdisciplinary project team includes conservation consultants, collection staff, and the Wyoming State Archaeologist. Together, they will develop an actionable, custom preservation plan responsive to their challenges controlling relative humidity within the storage facility. A Level 1 implementation project is intended for small to medium-sized institutions ready to implement smaller-scale improvements to environmental conditions or other sustainable measures previously identified through a general preservation or collections assessment. These awards are up to $100,000 for a period of performance of up to 2 years. An interdisciplinary team is not required. However, projects must have a preservation or conservation professional who works with collections on the project team. This is the first time NEH is offering the Sustaining Cultural Heritage Collections Implementation Level 1 grant. For a hypothetical example of a Level 1 project, perhaps your preservation assessment revealed the most immediate need is to establish an environmental monitoring program. You might propose the acquisition of digital temperature and humidity data loggers to monitor collection storage and exhibition spaces, and the hiring of consultants to help establish a program. Often intensive monitoring programs also evaluate the performance of HVAC systems. If there is need for upgrading the HVAC system, you may apply for additional funding in the future. Another example is perhaps your preservation assessment revealed a need to rehouse select collection objects sensitive to changes in relative humidity, such as parchment, in moisture buffering enclosures that mitigate the changes in relative humidity for those objects. Grant funds would cover the installation of storage systems and rehousing of collections that would improve energy efficiency and allow for greater temperature and relative humidity fluctuations in your storage environment. The Implementation 2 category provides funding for institutions to implement preventive conservation projects. These awards are up to $350,000 for a period of performance of up to 3 years. Institutions must have completed an interdisciplinary planning project prior to applying, in which they have identified the preservation needs of the collection. Level 2 projects might, for example, upgrade a building automation system to enable more active management of an HVAC system, or recommission or install an HVAC system that may include geothermal and solar. An example of a successful implementation Level 2 project comes from Taliesin West, the winter home and architectural laboratory of Frank Lloyd Wright. The project addressed sustainable improvements for the building envelope and environmental management systems in their archives and collection buildings. Prior to submitting their implementation grant proposal, they completed a planning project, which resulted in a comprehensive storage improvement plan. Within the scope of the implementation grant, they will install and insulate a low-emissive roof and replace an aging mechanical system with high-efficiency ducted HVAC systems in the storage vaults. These measures will improve interior environmental conditions, lessen airborne particulate transmission into the vaults, and reduce energy costs in the extreme Arizona desert climate. You may note that some activities, such as installing storage systems or improving security and protection of collections, are eligible for both Level 1 and 2 implementation projects. Both Implementation 1 and 2 projects should focus on institutional sustainability or resilience. It may help to keep in mind that the difference between the levels in part comes down to your prior planning and proposed scope of work. Level 1 projects are targeted for small and mid-sized institutions seeking to implement recommendations identified in a preservation assessment. For Level 2 projects, any sized institution may apply. However, there is an expectation that you have undertaken interdisciplinary planning that involves several stakeholders working together to address the sustainable preservation needs of your collection. Another important distinction to keep in mind is that Level 2 projects must provide schematic designs for proposed renovations. A detailed explanation of review criteria is found on page 33 of the Notice of Funding Opportunity, but I wanted to spend a few minutes focusing on three key areas that staff and reviewers look for in SCHC applications. The first is a description of the significance of the humanities collections that will benefit from the proposed project. SCHC applications ask for a lot of technical information about your building and environmental monitoring, but don't forget to tell the story of your collections too. Why are they important? Who uses them? You will want to convey how your collections are significant to the work of the humanities, which include research as well as educational and public programming. You should provide examples of unique or interesting objects, as well as a more general description of the collection scope that covers not just physical attributes, but matters of intellectual control as well. For collections that might be outside the bounds of traditional humanities, such as medical specimens or fine art collections, provide examples of research, exhibition, or other scholarship that demonstrates a connection to the humanities. Interdisciplinary collaboration during planning and implementation 2 projects is essential to successful SCHC proposals. Project teams will vary based on the project, but typically consist of consultants and members of the institution's staff and can include architects, building engineers, conservation scientists, conservators, curators, archivists, and facility managers. A preservation or conservation professional who works with collections must be included on your team regardless of the level of funding you are requesting. All members of the team should be identified in the application, and they should work collaboratively in both planning and implementation stages. These do not all need to be individuals at your organization, and a great many projects rely on outside consultants, especially at the planning stages. Your application needs to demonstrate not only how your collections will benefit from the project, but how it will also advance institutional goals of sustainability or resilience. How will you measure progress towards institutional sustainability and resilience goals? Will there be cost savings, reduction in carbon footprint or use of fossil fuels, continuity of operations after natural disasters? You should connect clearly project outcomes to long-term measurable goals when possible. Let us now turn to the application process for the SCHC program. Any U.S. nonprofit organization with 501c3 tax-exempt status, accredited public and 501c3 institutions of higher education, a unit of a state or local governmental agency, and federally recognized Native American tribal governments are eligible to apply for the SCHC grant program. Individuals, along with foreign or for-profit entities, are not eligible to apply. On page 10 of the SCHC Notice of Funding Opportunity, you will find a list of forms and attachments to include in your application. Please take careful note of which forms and attachments are required or conditionally required versus those that are optional. Among the attachments that are required to consider your application complete and eligible for review are a narrative, a research and related budget form, detailed work plan, a list of personnel, and two-page resumes or job descriptions for all key personnel. Other attachments, such as letters of support or documentation produced during prior assessments or planning efforts, are optional, but encouraged to strengthen your application. Please note that all construction contracts exceeding $2,000 are subject in their entirety to the Davis-Bacon Act. If your project proposes construction, renovation, repair, rehabilitation, or ground or visual disturbance, NEH may be required to review the project under Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act. This review may take from a few months to a year, and NEH will assist you with the process after an award is made. In order to determine if a review is required, we ask all applicants to include the SF 429A form with their application. On this form, please include as much detail as possible regarding your proposed project and any associated historic properties. The more information we have with your application, the faster we may be able to initiate and complete the review. More information is available on pages 35 and 36 of the Notice of Funding Opportunity and on the NEH website. The first review stage, and what we consider the foundation for our entire review process, is the peer review panel. Evaluators with expertise in the types of projects represented on the panel read the applications, write comments, and post a preliminary rating. Then they meet to discuss the applications, at which point they submit a final rating and any additional comments in support of their decision. You will note that the review criteria for SCHC adheres closely to the narrative sections, so it is in your interest to address each section in your proposal as thoroughly as you can. Altogether, SCHC reviewers will consider humanity's significance, as discussed earlier, methodology, attention to sustainable or preventive strategies, work plan, personnel, budget reasonableness, and project outcomes. Before you begin your SCHC application, it is a good idea to review carefully the program's Notice of Funding Opportunity, which is downloadable as a PDF, and other important information found on the program page. There you will find funding statistics and a list of sample narratives from successful applications. Applications for NEH grants, like many federal grants, are submitted through a web portal called grants.gov. If you are new to the system, I would recommend spending some time familiarizing yourself with it before you submit your application. Your institution, if it has not done so already, must register with the System for Award Management, or SAM for short, and grants.gov. You should allow several weeks to register for both. NEH will not waive the online submission requirement or extend the application deadline to allow additional time for you to complete registration with SAM or grants.gov. We strongly urge that you submit your application early to respond to any issues that you may encounter that could jeopardize your eligibility. Please note that support hours for grants.gov may change. You can resubmit the application package up until the deadline, but no materials may be added after the deadline, including letters of recommendation or parts of the package that are formatted incorrectly. Following peer review, NEH staff recommends which applications should move forward. Those recommendations are considered by the National Council on the Humanities, 26 people nominated by the President and approved by the Senate. The Council makes recommendations to the endowment's chair, who takes all this into consideration and makes the decision on which to fund. As you might imagine, the life cycle of your application is quite a long process, but it allows for rich review. After awards are announced, applicants can request the comments from their evaluators. If your proposal is not funded, the reviewer's comments can help you think about how to revise your proposal for next time. I strongly recommend that you reach out to a program officer with a short description of your project in the early stages of project development. They will be able to assist you to determine whether SCHC is the right fit for your project, as well as help determine which level of funding may be most appropriate for your needs. Applicants often get into trouble when they don't plan. You want to make sure that you have enough time to study the guidelines, prepare the scope of your project, consult with stakeholders such as facility staff, administration, and outside consultants in the planning and grant writing process. Evidence of an underprepared application tend to appear in a budget that does not adequately reflect the project activities or an underdeveloped discussion of the significance of your project. Remember to adhere to page limits and file formats for all components of your application. Failure to follow this guidance will result in your application being declared ineligible. Finally, whether you are funded, you should request feedback from your program officer after awards are announced. I realize that I've presented a lot of information in a compact format. You can find the Notice of Funding Opportunity along with other useful information such as sample successful application narratives on our website, neh.gov. If there is nothing else that you take away from this webinar, it should be that program staff are always available to assist you with questions about preparing and submitting your application. And one final piece of advice that I recommend everyone consider. Program officers are available to read drafts of your narrative proposals submitted to our preservation email account, preservation@neh.gov, no later than December 8th, 2022. Even if your draft is not fully developed, this can be a helpful and informative exercise. Thank you for listening to this webinar.